You're listening to Necropolis. This is a podcast brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelley from HateMeditations.com.
This episode is brought to you by all the fucking small dick energy people commenting on Necropolis on Hate Meditation's YouTube channel. This episode specifically for you guys. There are a couple of big dick energy guys on there, so don't feel offended, the few of you who have big dick energy, but yeah. We're going to delve into Deicide today, and I know we will ruffle some of the small dick energy people's feathers, so perhaps the best hillbilly band to ever come out of Florida. We are discussing that Deicide. We have Shelley co-host. Thank you for coming on, Shelley.
Hello. Good to be here.
Shelley, he talks like he has small dick energy, but he actually has very big dick energy. And you realize that over time with Shelley, like, he's more nuanced. He keeps, he's quiet until he really needs to speak up. But in all true honesty, he does have big dick energy. And I think Tyler here, he verges on the big dick energy here and there. Perhaps a little bit too much into the Samath. But that's okay. We all have, things that may hinder our big dick energy. So, thank you, Tyler, for coming on. And how are you doing with the COVID?
Pretty much fully recovered, man. I'll be heading back into work tomorrow, so feeling a lot better. Thanks for having me back on.
Yes, sir. It's always great to have you on and healthy. And too bad we missed you last week. And it would have been good to have your input on, some of the things we talked about. But yes, hillbilly death metal, perhaps the most aggressive kind ever. Deicide. What can I say about Deicide, which hasn't already been said? The first few albums are fucking amazing, and then they just had a record deal they had to fulfill and just released a lot of slop. And then eventually things hit a fever pitch with Glenn Benton and the Hoffman brothers. They split up. They talked a lot of shit about each other. And lo and behold, now we know that Glenn Benton got married in a church, and that is like the worst thing ever for the Hoffmans. They were trashing him. It was like, oh, you got married in a church. You're false. And all that. And a lot of stupid ass drama coming from the hillbillies. But after that, they reformed with Ralph Santola and Jack Owen. I had met Jack Owen back when he was in Deicide in 2006, right before I joined the Air Force. And he was cool as shit. It was actually Mother's Day. I met the Jack Owen, and I was at the Brass Mug before they relocated, the old one. And Jack Owen was there, and my mom called me because it was Mother's Day, and I hadn't called her in a while. And I was drinking beers. I'm like, no, Jack, you just talk to my mom. He talked to my mom for like fucking 5 minutes. And very nice guy. He'll talk to your moms if you want him to. But also later became friends with Ralph Santola. Long story short, Ralph wanted me in a project of his playing keyboards that never panned out. And it just stayed friends. And it was really funny. We just talked shit to each other for like 3 years, 4 years. Always just ragging on each other, and that's how our friendship was. We just talk shit to each other, and I guess that's like Shelley and his friends, like they just rag on each other, but it's all in jest. But kind of like American British humor in that aspect. Instead of say it's like, no, you're HIV positive, Ralph, and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure you would just say like penicillin positive or whatever in England. But when Ralph died, that hit me really hard. I had seen Deicide with the Hoffman brothers back when I was a young strapping guy. At I forget the place's name. It used to be right next to Hog Wild Records. It used to be this big venue. But yeah, I saw Deicide play there. Thornspawn opened for them too, and Thornspawn invited me backstage. I must have been 18 or 19. I thought that was the coolest thing ever that, I'm backstage at a Deicide show. I know, Tyler, you almost saw Deicide one time 18 years ago. I can only imagine how great that would have been, Tyler.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. So I won tickets to see Deicide around the time that they released the Stench of Redemption on a radio show. You had to answer a question and name three Deicide records, which was the easiest thing ever. And I was a huge fan of Deicide at the time, like I am now, and called in, got the tickets, and basically my car broke down on the day of the show, so I was not able to make it there. But yeah, almost saw them once, and haven't really bothered to go out to see them again. As I got older, I became a lot more anemic to going to metal shows. I only go out on very rare occasions now.
Well, I guess I'll start the live bragging as well. I saw them this year. No, it's not exactly the classic lineup or anything, but they did pretty much stick to an hour solid of their first three albums, with give or take a couple of tracks here and there. But yeah, it was a Brutal Assault festival I've been to quite a few times now. And the first time I was due to see them, I think it was can't remember which year it would have been now, 2019. They were due to play, but they couldn't fly over for some reason. I think it was visa problems or whatever. So ended up watching Candlemas instead, which was obviously a wildly different experience. But I'm very glad I got to see them in the end. And yeah, very uncommunicative, just an hour solid of kind of just wall to wall early Deicide, which made for a thoroughly enjoyable experience.
Yeah, when I saw them back when they played at the Hoffmans, the Hoffman, I forget which one his name is, but he was juicing on that steroids. He had these huge ass biceps on stage, and it was but Glenn Benton, he did do a lot of in between song bantering and really entertaining. It's all very lowbrow with him, but I think that kind of lends itself to his authenticity, where he's not the most articulate man out there, but he's able to get his point across, however crassly it may be. Just give his opinion, and he's truthful a lot of the times. Now, I don't know if he actually saw Bigfoot. He claims he did see a Bigfoot, but other than that, I think when he talks about music, at least he's pretty genuine. And he even admits that he's just a carnival man, is making his rounds and making money through the music industry. So, but it's kind of interesting. You compare him with like the other bands that are up around the early Tampa scene. I mean, there was Nasty Savage and all that. I guess the most other hillbilly band in Florida would be like Obituary, but I think Deicide is like out hillbillies them. Just like you imagine these guys actually living in a trailer park, whereas Obituary, they might just live in a pretty rundown house or something like that. But yeah, I kind of envision the DSI guys. I mean, Steve Eshim, he seems like a really nice guy and all that, but he's still a little hillbilly. But let's talk about the music. I know all the small dick energy people out there, like, you guys haven't even talked about the music at all yet. You're just talking about blah, 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 blah. Okay, calm down, small energy people. Small dick energies. Or no dick energies. I
Well, I was
know
going to
some of
say,
them.
so last year I reviewed, because Darkness Shall Rise, they have a habit of putting out early demos from a lot of like very well-known death metal bands. Tyler and I discussed a couple of them earlier this year. They put out some Unleashed and what was the other one? Uh, Fuck me, Swedish band. Never mind. Um, but yeah, they put out the early Amon demos, Sacrificial and Feasting the Beast, most of which ended up on the Deicide debut anyway. But I don't know if you guys have kind of listened to them and contrasted it with like the stuff, the material on the debut, because those tracks were a few years old by the time they got the Morrisound treatment. And yeah, I guess sort of feeding into the hillbilly point as well. I think the first time, so there was an infamous gig where it's like Deicide, Morbid Angel, and a couple of other Tampa bands playing at this hangar, and Scott Burns was doing the sound that night. And I think that's the first time Scott Burns met Glenn Benton, and they did not get on at first, although Glenn Benton obviously ended up trusting Scott a great deal. But yeah, at first he was very much like, annoyed at Scott Burns for sort of he didn't fuck up the sound. I think the tech he had wasn't great, and he was sort of trying to do his best to mix a death metal gig and a hanger. Um, but yeah, there's a real kind of random feral energy to the early stuff, but also the more you listen to it, it's kind of almost hypnotic in the way that it manages to combine the um, ferocity of death metal as it was in the late 80s with an odd kind of anthemic quality. Like there's a catchiness to the early material that is almost like rousing in a way. You want to stand up and kind of bellow along with it in a way that you don't with something like Morbid Angel or whatever.
I love that Feasting the Beast compilation. And yeah, with that with those versions and even with the first album, really there's kind of almost a heavy metal influence in some of the riffing. I think that kind of is along the lines of what you're saying, Shelley, with the anthemic quality that you hear a bit. And yeah, you get some really uh, how do I want to put it? Epic or, as you put it, rousing quality to some of the riffing, like the opening to Sacrificial Suicide, for instance. Um, and yeah, it really makes those early tracks really endearing in a way. And because of that, in some ways, the self-titled is one of the could almost be one of my favorite of the first three Deicide releases.
Yeah, I was just revisiting that. I mean, uh, I'm obviously more fluent in the Deicide Legion, more than the eponymous debut album. Because I view Amon Feast and the Beast more like a demo. Like it is kind of a compilation, and the songs are repeated on the eponymous album. But yeah, I did spend a little bit of time with the first album, and yeah, it was very fucking solid, and it really makes me appreciate what DSI Legion is. It took all the elements from the debut album, which was kind of like a let's take the possessed formula and crank the dial to 11. That's what and I even read an interview where Glenn Benton admitted that Possessed was a huge influence, and it totally makes sense. Just like Possessed, more realized in a death metal way, less thrash influenced. But Legion, I think takes the formula from that and just dials the aggression and the primal expression to 11 and whatnot. So. It's really interesting. There's great tracks on it. Glenn Benton does rap, and he's always kind of continued having very distinctive like vocal cadences in Deicide, even the new Deicide, the NU Deicide that's parading around today. He's still. I listened to a couple of new Deicide songs, and it's all about the vocals. Pretty much, the music's based around the vocal patterns, and the vocals drive the music along. Whereas in early death metal, everything just works as a whole. It's not really built around vocal cadences and whatnot. But all around, I think it's a very solid album. Deicide Legion's obviously a favorite, and also I like the one that followed, Once Upon a Cross. After that, I do view Deicide as really dropping the ball like substantially over and over and over. This is why it's maybe difficult to do an episode on Deicide because there's so much crap that they've released that we'd rather not talk about.
Well,
However,
going back to the debut, the point you made about the vocals is actually really interesting because I think for the caliber of death metal that was coming out at that time, it is one of the most vocal centered albums from that era. Tracks like Oblivious to Evil, and even Sacrificial Suicide as well. Like there is an element where a lot of the music sculpts itself around, as you mentioned, like the vocal cadences or the stanzas that Benton is trying to get out, and also there's a lot of work done to multi-track his vocals. So he has the higher end, he has the lower end, and particularly on Legion, they do it together to give that effect of like coming apart and being possessed by multiple demonic entities and so on. But also they fuck with the vocals as well. They slow it down, speed it up, or whatever to make it sound even more monstrous. which, other bands, the vocals were there, but you're right in terms of saying it was treated much more as a whole, as like a holistic approach. And I think that's where the anthemic quality that Tyler and I keep pointing to as comes in, is because there is a separation between the music and the vocals that is quite unusual for death metal. And yeah, to come back to another point, Possessed influence is clear. I would also say there's an obvious Slayer influence on, particularly the debut as well, that really comes through, mixed in with, what else was going on in Tampa at the time.
Well, no, man, you apparently did not listen to like Deicide interviews and things from the time. They did not use any effects on Glenn Benton's vocals, on that early stuff. That was all Glenn
Oh
Benton did
shit!
that all
Tyler just
himself.
came in and smacked Shelly. I was like, "Well, sir, well, my fine gentleman friend, no, that is not the case in this instance. You obviously have not studied the subject." But I
So,
really, but regardless of
are you going
him,
to listen to a track like Dead by Dawn and tell me that's all real?
No,
I,
I don't
I,
think it's all real. I just
I know,
remember
I know
reading that.
he would record three tracks, doing different vocal styles on each. So he would record like the lows, the mids, and the highs separately, and I guess they would just mix it in that way.
Yeah, I
Where
know. I'm aware of that, and obviously you can tell that with Legion. But there are moments on the debut where it's not a human. It's
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I just remember reading that he claimed that he didn't use any effects on his vocals, and people called him out for it and said, "No, it's pretty obvious that you are."
yeah, okay, fair enough.
So how about Glenn Benton seeing Bigfoot? You guys believe he saw Bigfoot?
No.
I believe he thinks he saw Bigfoot in the same way that he believes there were no, unless Scott Burns applied them after the fact and just Benton wasn't aware of it. But
Maybe Scott Burns dressed up as Bigfoot and went parading around Glenn Benton's house or something, too.
Okay, all right. Do you think Glenn Benton has big dick energy or small dick energy?
Definitely has big dick energy.
I
he's a,
think he has more like Prince Albert energy. There's something a little off kilter about him.
I was going to say he's a big dick trapped inside a small dick.
Yeah,
Ooh.
yeah. That could be true. There could be some compensation going on there.
But getting back to the Dead by Dawn, it's really cool how he did the vocals on that to kind of mimic like Deadites from the not Dead Alive. It was oh my god, I'm
Evil
gonna get
Dead.
fled. Evil Dead. Thank you. The small dick energy people are about to come out on me and say, "You don't remember Evil Dead, Jason? You fucking poser." Okay, small dick energy. I'm done saying the small dick energy stuff. I know this is kind of irking everyone at this point, even the big dick energy people.
Why are you talking so much on a podcast where you talk? You guys just talk to hear yourselves talk.
Man, yeah. I mean, I really like
We've
the
said
comments more. I
dick
like
more
the.
times than Deicide in this episode.
I think the Spotify people are cooler than the YouTube people, but it is what it is.
Hey, don't insult my babies.
It's all good. It's all good. But yeah. So that came out. The Deicide came out in 1990. I was 6 years old. Tyler, were you even alive?
I was 1 year old.
1 year old. I know, Shelly. You were like 2 or 3, right?
I was 1.5, literally, almost exactly.
Oh, Shelly
I
and
was
I
born
are
in
almost the
January
same age.
'89. Nice.
Yep. Isn't it
Yeah.
strange that stuff exists before you exist?
Oh, dude, that's my whole music taste, man. I mean, like, fuck, I like Morbid Angel. They were out. They what fucking Altars of Madness came out in '89, so year I was born. I mean, I like Slayer. Rain and Blood came out. I think was that '89,
Rain and Blood was '86.
'86.
Yeah,
So yeah, even
86.
before I
Yeah.
was born. And I mean, and I mostly listened to the albums before that one. So yeah, like
Well, Hunting
I'm
Chapel
accustomed to
was
that.
83, right?
No,
I
maybe,
think it
maybe it
was.
was. Yeah,
Let me look it
because
up.
maybe I thought
Hunting
Show No Mercy came
Chapel.
out in '83.
Oh shit! No, that was 84. Huh? What came out in 83? Oh, Show No
Pretty sure it
Mercy.
was
Yeah.
Show No Mercy. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So,
Any
like,
other
the
thoughts about
Debu's
Deicide?
like
Deicide?
it's a good introduction to that style of death metal, I think, because of the catchiness, because of the variety as well. Like they do mix it up quite a lot for quite a short album. Like by the end, tracks like Day of Darkness and Crucifixion, I think, speak to the epic qualities that Tyler mentioned earlier. And there's like it's like a little, I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
can see the
What?
more of a Slayer influence on those songs than a Possessed
Yeah,
influence. Yeah,
it's
especially like
like
with the lead guitar work.
Yeah. It's like buying your first car and it works really well and it has all the features that you love and you're still getting used to driving and sort of getting used to it. And then feeding into like Legion is like a Porsche by comparison where all of the elements are sort of slicked down and like just really kind of flashy looking and completely sort of, I don't know, efficient and sped up. And everything is sort of shaved off. You need to eat your Deicide debut before you can get into Legion because that is not an entry level album by any measure, in my
Holy
opinion.
shit! I went backwards. I went once upon a cross to Legion to Deicide. That's how I got into it when I was younger.
No, I think I went Once Upon the Cross, Deicide, then Legion. I sort of bounced around.
Oh, I mean, like Once Upon the Cross, you kind of have a similar effect to the debut. I think there's a bit more of anthemic quality to some of those songs. It's almost like they kind of went back to some of the songwriting of the debut, but with like the advanced technical knowledge they gained from writing Legion. So
So
you're kind of going along the same path doing that.
we are also jumping around, but just a piece of trivia on Once Upon the Cross. I think the original album was only about 20 minutes long, and Roadrunner asked them to slow all the tracks down to make it up to nearly half an hour so that they could release it as an album. But everything else, the original like tracks that they recorded were all way faster.
Holy shit!
I
It would
heard
have
that
sung
same
better
legend about.
faster.
Yeah.
I was just like playing a couple of songs in my head real quick, like the riffs at least. I mean, they would have like when Satan rules this world. I've always hated how da 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 da, and that would have sounded way cooler if it was da 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 da. Like faster and more aggressive.
Yeah,
Well, yeah.
I heard that same legend about Legion actually, that it was a lot faster when they originally played it, and then they slowed it down because it was going to be too short of an album.
Well, yeah. This is where the umbrage between Benton and the Hoffman brothers comes from, in part, is because the Hoffman brothers didn't have a good work ethic. They were really slow at composing material. So that's kind of one reason why each album is very short, although I do really appreciate how short they are because they are efficient pieces of death metal. But also it's the fact that they would have played a lot of these tracks faster. And as Jason said, particularly on Once Upon the Cross, it would have been a huge improvement. And rather than just, I don't know, writing 2 or 3 additional songs to make it up to half an hour of really intense death metal. They just slowed the material they had down because the Hoffman brothers were too slow and like indecisive in sort of writing new material, and Benton just kind of lost
Well,
patience and said, "Look, we'll just cut the tempo."
Tyler, Tyler, you might know this. When did Steve Ashium start writing the music for Deicide?
I
I
actually
thought it was
don't
pretty
know
early
this.
on. Um,
I think it might be pretty early on, but I'm not actually sure when he started writing the music for Deicide.
yeah,
There
I know.
was a couple of tracks on Legion that he wrote. I think he wrote Behead the Prophet and maybe a couple of others, but definitely by Serpents of the Light, I think he was writing most of the material. Correct me if I'm wrong in
Boo,
the comments, though.
boo, Serpents of the Light. Ugh,
That's why
that's
you
like
don't have your
totally like
drummer write your
pop death
material.
metal. But yeah. I guess we have talked a little bit about the first quote unquote album, not the Amon album, but the Deicide. So yeah, let's get to the meat and potatoes. Got Legion, came out in 1992, and obviously I was not into death metal at that point. I was 8. Give me another 4 years, and I would have been into death metal. But what I've heard, how people first like old timies from the, especially in San Antonio when I was living there, listening to the older metalheads speak about when they first heard Legion, it just blindsided everybody. It just came out and it just became an instant classic. It was like the most primal and aggressive death metal at the time. I think they took the formula from, I said this earlier, they took the formula from the first album and just like really fucking made it aggressive. And yeah, just when people talk about Deicide, it's usually Legion that they're speaking about. So all the elements of the debut album are certainly there. However, it's all presented in a more coherent package. It's more realized. It is a very primal and aggressive expression. Someone once told me that Glenn Benton has fetal alcohol syndrome. That's why, or someone in Deicide has fetal alcohol syndrome, which I don't know is true or not. It's just a rumor. That's why Legion is such a fluke. It's only capturing, magic or lightning once. But whenever I listen to it and it clicks for me, I'm like, yeah, I can see, just one an anomaly just happening from, perhaps someone with, some issues mentally. How about
Well,
you,
there
Shelley?
are other
What do you think about Legion?
well, there are other death metal bands that are like one-hit wonders. Dismember comes to mind. We don't have to reach for fetal alcohol syndrome to explain it. It's just some bands only got one in them. Deicide have, I would say, two and a half, three and a half in them. But yeah, Legion is definitely the standout moment that kind of puts them on the map as one of the greats of the original wave of death metal. And as I was doing in my clumsy car analogy, when I realized halfway through I don't know fuck all about cars, so I probably shouldn't have gone with that. But yeah, Legion is definitely the polished up version of the debut where the influences ebb away and the identity of the band comes to the fore. You still have, as you said, you still have elements of the debut there. There is still a catchiness to it if you squint hard enough. There's, as we mentioned already, there's the frantic vocals, which kind of a lot of the music still kind of bends itself around, but at this point it is much more of a unified vision. And that's partly because the vocals are kind of tearing themselves apart and splitting off in different directions, and at the same time the rhythm is it's a very very percussive album that's constantly stumbling over its own rhythms, and it's just always introducing disruptive fills, and it just feels like it's always stumbling, and then it kind of manages to carry itself around again. I remember it was very early on in like my death metal journey, for want of a better word, where I was listening to this, and yeah, just like when the first track Satan Spawn comes in, I was really actually struggling to cling on to like where's one in in this, and it's just the way that it manages to bend itself around like that is just it is spellbinding in a way, and it's why it never gets old, never gets boring. And I would say, yeah, what else was I going to say about it? There was one other thing. Oh yeah, there was.
Revocate the agitator, revocate the agitator.
Relocate the alligator, relocate the alligator.
Uh, yeah, that's a banger, and that's actually one of the first songs that I latched onto because it's the only one. Well, it's not the only one, but it has a very distinctive melodic line in the main riff that it's probably one of the only times it kind of mirrors slightly more melodic death metal. I'm thinking more like the Swedish bands or whatever, but the rest of it is so fucking like dense and unforgiving in the way that it barrages the listener. Um, but yeah, it's there was a bit of not controversy, but again, Benton and the Hoffman brothers arguing because they could not settle on the guitar tone. I think there was this amp shop around the corner from Morrisound that they used all the time, and they let Scott Burns just rent amps from them for all the different bands they were recording there. And I think the Hoffman brothers tried almost every amp in the shop before they just went back to the original amp that they were using. I think it was a Marshall of some sort, but yeah, it was, it was at that point where I think in the Burns interview he's saying like some bands come in with a pre-prepared guitar tone and there might be some tweaking to get it studio ready, but otherwise it's good to go. But the Hoffman brothers just had no idea what they wanted, and they literally had to spend a day in this amp shop just trying every single one before settling on a tone that no one was really happy with. Obviously, it's gone down in history as one of the best death metal bands ever recorded, so it worked out. But at the time, they were sort of dissatisfied with that. But yeah, unbelievable album.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
Glenn Benton said that in an interview that I saw they did a number of years ago, like 20 years ago. He said that Legion was not well received, and over time it became like the best selling death metal album. But when it first came out, it wasn't that well received, which I have a hard time believing that, especially hearing people's anecdotes about it, about when it came out, and just like how different it was compared to everything else. Like when King Foley from Deceased was talking shit about Chuck and Death, where Scream Bloody Gore came out, it wasn't extreme enough. I think people are looking more like forward to something like Legion coming out, like true feral death metal that would scare the shit out of normal people. And yeah, it's more like a more realized version of death metal at that time. I mean, Morbid Angel went more of like an artsy route and very like Trey. His approach to guitar is way more intellectual than the Hoffmans. But and of course, the frontman. You compare David Vincent to Glenn Benton. It's like a something like a IQ point difference of like 50 compares like three standard deviations. They probably couldn't have an intelligible conversation with each other. Glenn Benton would bring up Bigfoot and drinking 2 bottles of Jack Daniels a day, and David Vincent would probably talk about Lord Byron or something. I don't know.
I do have some comments on that, but Tyler, I know you were about to talk on Legion.
yeah, you were just talking about the guitar tone. That's one thing that, and forgive me, all of the small member energy people, that I find disappointing slightly about Legion is that in some ways, like the production is a little bit less raw than the first album. I kind of almost appreciate the production from the first one a little more. And but that being said, Legion's a phenomenal album. It's freaking evil. But interestingly enough, have you guys ever heard the live bootleg "Behold the Faceless Dog"?
I
I
have
have, yeah,
once, yeah.
yeah.
And that
It's
that
vicious.
bootleg is
It's
really interesting.
vicious.
Yeah, it's interesting for that very reason because you get the first songs played with like the more furious, like technical ability of Legion, like the songs from the first album. But then you also get the songs from Legion with like a much more like raw approach that's kind of more like the production from the first album. So it's kind of like a really cool meeting of both worlds on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other aspect of the album that I really enjoy, but some people have a problem with, is the bass. In that it's very kind of mid-range. It's not a bass driven album. Like there's bass in the guitar tone and stuff, but the actual bass kind of clicks through the middle of the mix rather than sort of underpinning it in a lot of ways. And I think again that was a compromise that they had to reach based on the intensity of the music versus the guitar tone and the mixing of the rest of it. Is they wanted to make the bass lines cut through, but they were disappointed that it didn't sound powerful enough. But for me, it kind of it just lends itself to that percussive energy again. It's not a soundscaping album. It's not got much atmosphere to it in an obvious way. It's much more sort of a physical experience in a lot of ways, which, yeah, again, contrast to Morbid Angel, for instance, that although something like Blessed of the Sick is very kind of stripped back and sparse, it has a kind of, for want of it's going to sound ridiculously pretentious, but it has a meta atmosphere to it that is lacking on Legion, I think.
That's kind of meta. Yeah, Legion's just fucking great. The fucking great riffs are fast as shit. And the album's really quick too. Just as soon as you put it on, and it's really one of those albums that you have to listen to it in its entirety, even though it's short. It's not too hard to do, just to listen to the whole thing. But so many of the riffs are so similar. Like the songs just bleed together so much. So it's really just like a whole holistic experience, sitting down and absorbing it all in one sitting, or if you're driving or whatnot. Which
Yeah, I think that's what I was going
I
to
think.
say. Is like, sorry, go on.
Well, I've my CD is in my car actually, and I listen to it while driving. It's perfect for sitting in traffic, blasting out everyone sitting in traffic with you.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is like the debut, you could pick out singles, as it were, and they stand out as individual tracks that you could not play on the radio, but play on metal radio or whatever. Whereas, yeah, you're right that the Legion is a singular piece of art in itself. Yeah, I know each track really well and the ins and outs of it, but it does kind of fly by as a singular sort of as a whole.
I get the same feeling from Samhath's Godless Arrogance. That's another one that it makes more sense if you listen to it fully in one sitting. Like all the different dynamics going on with that, the variations of instrumentation, what becomes more prominent at any given point, and kind of like a symphony. We already discussed that, but I don't view Legion as like a symphony. Whereas a symphony does have a kind of similarity there with it has to be absorbed in its entirety to get it. But the symphonies are different movements. Whereas it's more like one continuous expression coming out in Legion rather than it being chopped up and presentable in different dissected areas or anything like that. But yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely
I'd
view it
liken
as
it
a.
to. So I think Transylvanian Hunger is another example of an album that I listened to it as an album, but the jump from Deicide to Legion, I'd compare it to someone like Atheist, who were a similar band that kind of came out of nowhere, and the debut piece of Time is still like I adore the album, and it's still notable for how progressive and jazzy it was at the time because they were one of the trailblazers of that style within death metal. But it's a little bit unfocused and still mired in some of the influences. There's still a holdover of typical death metal and thrash as well, because Atheist started as more of a thrash band, and then you get Unquestionable Presence, where it's their version of Legion, where it is just it flows by as a singular work of art, and it's a similar length as well. It's only about half an hour, but it has the same degree of efficiency, the same density to it, but it feels very, very intuitive. I think, yeah, as different as both artists are, they do mirror each other in that way. And then, likewise, falling off the quality a little bit with the third album as well, with Elements and Once Upon the Cross kind of still having traces of each artist's like signature style, but you know, showing signs of fatigue, as it were, for different reasons.
What would you consider bands like similar to the Deicide, the early Deicide? Like I was trying to think about that earlier. Like obviously there's Luciferian from Sweden, I believe, their first album. The Manifest, I believe that's what it's called. Very influenced by both early Deicide and early Morbid Angel. But I was kind of thinking too, and this album I believe came out around like 1994, so it came after Legion. But I can also hear a little bit of Once Upon the Cross in it too, but it's Sinister's Cross the Styx, and especially on songs like Compulsory Resignation, Corridors to the Abyss, and Putrefying Remains. I hear a very distinct Deicide DNA in those tracks. But other than those, like, have you guys heard any bands that really kind of try to capture the lightning that Deicide had early on?
I definitely concur with Sinister up to Hate as well, in terms of the
I would say Hate is more closer to Once Upon the Cross than Legion.
yeah, okay, I could see that. Um, Tyler, what are your thoughts?
It's really difficult to think of an early death metal band that really fully kind of isn't I how do I want to put this, a parallel to Deicide's approach. Sinister is kind of a good example. I mean, they have that kind of Dutch approach though, where they like to um, vacillate between like a kind of grinding rhythmic approach and then something that is more melodic. You can definitely hear that on like Sinister's debut album, Cross the Sticks. Um, so yeah, I can't really.
I'd say maybe
Uh,
someone like Vader a bit.
Vader, yeah, somewhat is along those lines. I mean, Vader has similar influences from, like the early kind of thrash metal. Like, definitely, there's a lot more Slayer, I think, in Vader than there is even in
Oh yeah,
Deicide.
there's a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
thrash Invader, more so than anything Deicide ever had.
yeah, but just for the density and like the just the energy of it. Um,
Yeah, the Luciferian album I'm thinking of is called Demonication, The Manifest, in parentheses. But they kind of have a like this hybridization of early Morbid Angel and early Deicide. Don't really succeed in either, but it's good for what it is. But when it comes to actual like which is better, they're definitely far behind their influences. But
I
yeah,
mean, one
other
band
than
we've not discussed that does come to mind is Christian from Brazil, who not nearly as rhythmically
like
complex
Black
because they're
Force Remains or Black Force Domain.
yeah, sort of it matches it for the intensity, but not the complexity.
Yeah, yeah, they're way more simplistic than Deicide.
Well, they don't really do tempo changes. They're not a grindcore band, but I'd say in spirit they are. But yeah,
Yeah, I remember the first album I heard by them was Conquerors of Armageddon. When it was new, I believe it was still like a new release, and then I went back and I heard Black Force Domain. It's good for what it is, but it's not top shelf. But it doesn't matter. We're like bands with similar vibes as Deicide. I could see it a little bit, not that much. Yeah, I think Sinister, perhaps early Sinister, is closest
yeah.
to Deicide. Uh,
To
if
go back,
if you have some big dick energy out there, please let us know in the comments who else. Kind of similar to early Deicide. We mentioned a few bands. If you want to chime in with others, please let us know.
yeah. To move on slightly, you were talking about comparing Glenn Benton to David Vincent earlier on, and it was a comparison that I wanted to draw. Um, not musically. Obviously, we've established that they are very different beasts musically and intellectually to some extent as well. But of the two like original Tampa bands, they were the two that you could mark out as like going above and beyond as far as death metal is concerned. They weren't your what is it tracksuit wearing um, dudes that Euronymous had a real problem with when he was like railing against death metal at the time because we've already discussed the fact that Altars of Madness is one of the few or only death metal albums that the black metal scene took seriously, although I think they took far more than they let on, to be honest. But yeah, they did draw a lot of influence from that album. And Deicide as well. I can't remember specifically off the top of my head, but just in terms of the fact that those two bands, just looking at them, they walked the walk for a time, although obviously they don't so much anymore. But back then, one could take them more seriously than some of the other bands that were very much just, well, Death being the obvious candidate there, who's sort of making it very clear that it's just for show, and he's sort of treating it more like you treat, a slasher film or something. It's just a bit of fun. Um, it's just an interesting comparison. They're almost like Apollo and Dionysus in that regard, in that Apollo is Morbid Angel and Dionysus is Deicide.
Yeah, I mean, you could draw the parallel to Hegel being Glenn Benton and David Vincent being Arthur Schopenhauer. I don't know. But so I know we talked a little about the rivalry between the bands. I don't think Deicide ever knew about the rivalry. It was more Morbid Angel just in the background, just trash talking Deicide. I don't recall them ever trash talking Morbid Angel. I never recall them ever mentioning Morbid Angel. Period. But yeah, Morbid Angel. Like I was really good friends with some of the inner circle of that band, and one of the members, I'm not going to say who, had a Deicide shirt on his doormat for people to wipe their feet on it. But other than that, I'm unsure how deep the rivalry goes. I may just because Deicide started getting really popular. That's probably why Morbid Angel saw him as competition. But the
Well,
approach
not
is
necessarily
completely
like a
fucking different.
rivalry, but a retrospective comparison of the two in spirit, if not in deed. Like you just take their stance compared to a lot of the other bands of the time, and there's an obvious comparison there. They were more esoteric, they were more focused on religion in a lot of ways, whereas most of the other Tampa bands were sort of uh, gore or sort of classic straightforward horror. Whereas there is more of a kind of visceral edge to both those bands that I think is particularly chimed with black metal, but kind of had more staying power than your Cannibal Corpses or your Obituary as well to some extent as well, who are much more simplistic than both of them.
Yeah, I mean the hillbillies in Florida definitely Obituary and Deicide. I'm probably thinking a couple others, but they're not big enough for me to cast shade at them. Or throw shade or whatever the saying goes. But yeah, it's interesting. Like it'd be really interesting to see the two stuck in a room, David Vincent and Glenn Benton, just to see like how the three standard deviations play out in the real world between two frontmen. That'd be interesting. Yeah, David Vincent seems like he has a lot to say, but he's also very introverted and just is very selective of what he says. Whereas Glenn Benton, he just throws out whatever comes to mind. Yeah, and the bands had completely different fucking approaches to quote unquote blasphemy. Glenn Benton takes, Satan like as a real, I guess you would call it theistic Satanism, where it's, even though he in real life is an atheist, but in the music he sings like Satan is real and we're going to worship him and sacrifice and all that. Whereas Morbid Angel, they would cast shade at that. They do have songs about like bleed for the devil and all that, but they go way beyond that into like you said very esoteric themes and very occult themes. Whereas Deicide's more like he went to Baptist school and he's upset and he's just using baptism against baptism. So yeah.
Tyler, what are your thoughts? Is Tyler still with
Sorry,
us?
I hit the wrong mute button. Anyway,
Sorry.
so thoughts on the difference between Morbid Angel and Deicide here? Is that what we're discussing?
Uh, yeah, that or just thoughts on Legion before we move on as well.
Okay. Well, thoughts on Legion are pretty succinct and easy to wrap up. I mean, that album, honestly, I don't know if I would call it a fluke. I think you can hear a clear line of development of it from the first album, but it certainly is kind of a miraculous entry into the early death metal canon. And like I said, the big thing that I think kind of makes Deicide stand out very interestingly is how incredibly dark and evil it is compared to other death metal, which I think kind of lines up with talking about how other death metal bands were really focused on things like gore and zombies, which has its own level of darkness to it. But DSI kind of takes it to an entirely different level, which is something that they definitely most highlight on Legion. Something that almost in a different way approaches what some black metal bands were to do later. Another interesting note, since there was kind of some rivalry there, so to speak. Um, but you don't really hear any other death metal band for the most part, at least at that time period, try for as dark and evil of an approach as Deicide had. And even when they did later on, it has a lot of influence from sort of the wake of what black metal did, to where darkness and evil kind of is always represented in extreme metal, sometimes unfortunately, as having a kind of creepy melodic effect, which Deicide didn't really have in their music, and yet still were able to invoke a sense of darkness and sort of satanic evil that not really too many other death metal bands were able to do, if they even really attempted that approach at all. So in that regard, I think Legion to this day kind of still stands as a landmark album in the genre.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, my dog was whining. I had the door closed, and she's on the other side just whining. um, let's see. I take the whole Bob Larson stuff that happened with Glenn Benton, where he would dial into Bob Larson's show and pretend to be super spooky and evil and all that, saying that demons are going to get Bob Larson. That just kind of lends itself to the carnival aspect, I believe, to his interpretation of like what evil death metal should be. Um, and it's over the top. It's like theistic Satanism, and in mainstream discourse, what Satanism is more atheistic than anything else. But there are some renegade groups that actually believe in uh, different deities and all that. But Satanism, like the Church of Satan and Temple of Satan or Satanic Temple, they're all essentially atheists, humanists at that, secular humanists. And they don't believe in any evil deities or anything like that. But there's some Luciferian strains, like the Greater Church of Lucifer that Michael Ford had, and we talked about that when he was on the podcast. Really cool guy from Black Funeral, where I take his approach more genuinely than anything Glenn Benton does. Like he flat out says he's a carnival act. So when you guys say is you hear the evil in it, or I don't see the evil in the lyrics. I see it in the music itself, like the atmosphere that comes out. But the lyrics always seemed a little cheesy to me. And he does rap occasionally, and that's another thing too. Is like Glenn Benton, I don't know if he realized he was rapping or not on the debut album, but he certainly does rap. And that I just think he kind of it kind of works into the vocal cadence and style he was going for. But yeah, there's some parts of the vocals themselves that kind of a little off putting here and there. But
Well, if you
the
think,
music itself,
do you just mean like delivering the lyrics fast? Because like loads of bands do that. Like Slayer does that. DRI, like
Yeah,
delivering
I
the
think it's just a consequence of the harsh vocals, like pretty much the only purpose they can have until you get to like modern metal that kind of uses them melodically in a really lame way is pretty much the only like function they have is rhythmic. So if you're going to do something kind of cadenced with harsh vocals, then you're going to get that kind of like rhythmic approach with them. I mean, like a lot of other death metal bands, and in many ways, I prefer this approach. Tend to almost use harsh vocals in a kind of like off rhythm way, where they're usually like mixed kind of into the background, where they're almost like a textural instrument. But yeah, Glenn Benton obviously on early Deicide and obviously on later Deicide as well. He had a much more cadenced approach. So yeah, it's going to become a highlight, and it's going to become something where you can identify like a kind of like catchy rhythm unfolding from the vocals from the stanzas he's doing.
yeah, and just to go back to Jason's point, on the darkness of it, I do tend to agree that the darkness comes from the delivery and the music, or the combination of the delivery of the vocals and the music together. And I would say, like with the whole Bob Larson thing, I think that was obviously a stunt, and I think they ended up being friends or something. Not friends, but kind of did openly admit that it was all just like a little bit of fun that they were having. But equally, it kind of reminds me of an interview in the film Until the Light Takes Us, where Varg is talking about how he was just sat in the Helvet record shop just chatting with, I can't remember which other guy it was, but they were just chatting about how they like to eat their cornflakes. And then some kid walks in and is like really starstruck by these two black metal dudes, and they're just having this really mundane conversation about breakfast cereal. And it's kind of that shattering of the mystique in some ways, where obviously when you become an adult you realize, yeah, it was just, there was a lot of theater and a lot of playing up to various things, but that's part of the point of what metal is, and I don't think you should downplay the importance of that in the experience. Whereas a lot of other death metal bands, particularly in the Tampa scene, were very much just um, in real life kind of just boring dudes, like very normal, very personable, friendly. Yeah, there was drama, there was lots of rumors and backstabbing, particularly around death and stuff, but they were all just you know normal dudes. And
Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that Glenn Benton just was a bit of a renegade in that respect.
Yeah, we'll touch about the renegade stuff a little bit later when we get to Scars of the Crucifix and that music video. But something that can be said about how the Norwegians they said Morbid Angel is acceptable, but I don't recall them ever saying Deicide was acceptable. Like with the whole black metal movement, it's okay to still appreciate Morbid Angel, but yeah, don't recall them ever talking well about Deicide either. So.
No, neither do I. But I think there's still a case to be made for them standing apart for just, as Tyler keeps saying, sort of emphasizing the darkness and the evil aspect, when a lot of other bands were, they had a darkness to them, particularly on the American side, but it was much more about aggression and speed and disruption rather than the layering on the top. I think that was more of a European feature, where you get this dark romantic edge with bands like Therion and to some extent even like Entombed and Carnage and things like that, where there is a much more obvious dark atmosphere to those early Swedish albums. Um, but should we move on to Once Upon the Cross? Uh, Speaking of
Sure.
darkness, well, it's actually probably the brightest album they've had so far.
Yeah,
Uh,
production wise, it's definitely the cleanest sounding of all the Deicides from this period, at least. Yeah, this was my gateway into Deicide back when I was a youngin. of course, I actually discovered Deicide way later than Morbid Angel. I was probably 15 or so when I finally got around to Deicide. And this Once Upon the Cross was the album I discovered first. Um, I thought, oh my god, I have a stupid story. When I was 18, I used to, I had some metalhead friends, punk and metalheads, and we drank the beer as minors and all that, and we got an invitation to a kegger. And by the way, I threw a shit ton of keggers back then, but we got to this kegger, and there's a whole bunch of high school kids just moping around, sipping beer, not going. And I take over the music, and I put in "Once Upon the Cross," and I just blast them all out, and I drink all their beer. I float the keg, and it's like deuces. but yeah, good times. Yeah, this was a really great album to discover back then. Now, I definitely rate Legion higher. But there's some solid songs on it. Like when you said it was originally meant to be sped up, it's like immediately clicked for me. Like yes, it would sound a little bit better if the tempi were a little bit faster. But yeah, it's still fucking solid. Great riffs on this album. There's some interesting lyrics as well. Like they are the children of the underworld. Born in the mountain of Mashu's magic. It's like, well, what the fuck was Glenn Benton reading back then? But I know, like, you made the connection to. Tyler made the connection to Vader with, or that was Shelley who made the connection. Tyler amplified that. But Vader, they took their lyrics from external sources, like Crowley. The Peter from Vader. He utilized not Vincent Crowley, Aleister Crowley. Some of his writings and his lyrics, like the vision and the voice, that's from a thing from Aleister Crowley. I think the same thing can be said about They Are the Children of Underworld, but I don't know where Glenn Benton found Mashu's magic from the mountain. But it definitely doesn't seem like he just thought this up. He definitely derived the lyrics from some other source. Do you guys happen to know what Mashu's magic is?
Nope. Oh, I
I
thought you
have
were going
no
to explain
idea.
it to me. No, but
Oh my god, I should know this. It's fucking Gilgamesh.
oh, right, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Mashu's from Gilgamesh. Oh my
Well,
god,
that
I'm a
makes
fucking
sense.
idiot.
Um, I should probably know that because I read that not I read that this year, I think. Anyway,
Oh really?
uh,
I read that a long time ago. But I
I
recently
think it was
skimmed
still
over sections of it for a
yeah, it was still
course.
when my son was quite young, so I was very sleep deprived. I should probably read it again, to be honest. But um, yeah, Once Upon the Cross, it's a mixed bag for me because yeah, I think it was the first Deicide album I heard. So when I first got it, I was like, yep, this is going to be my jam. But now that once you get into the debut and Legion, I sort of every time I put Once Upon the Cross on, I'm just like I'd rather be listening to the first two albums. There are some strong numbers on there, as you were talking about the Children of the Underworld, the title track "To Be Dead," and some other sort of smatterings. But I think it's Deicide light, and it's also, if possible, a little bit too um, I don't want to say self-aware, but it feels like a band trying to imitate Deicide. Everything from the cover art to tracks like Kill the Christian, where it's just a little bit. It sounds stupid me saying it's too on the nose for a band like Deicide because they were pretty much on the nose from the start, but it feels like a bit of a pale imitation in a lot of ways. And yeah, the whole tempo thing does make a lot of sense because there are moments where yeah, it's a fast album, it's chugging along nicely, but it feels a bit ploddy and a bit clunky, like it's not really going anywhere. So yeah, it's one of these where I could sort of do without it.
Yeah, the lyrics are pretty cringe. Open the door, Jehovah, you whore. That's how when Satan rules this world starts out. And
Yeah, it's a bit
he's
Paul
making
Bettany by
fun of,
that point.
yeah, he's making fun of Jehovah's Witnesses. Open the door, Jehovah, you whore. But
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
the
a
tackiness started getting amplified with this album. Definitely came more prominent with like "Blame It on God" with "Serpents of the Light." It's like, what the fuck, dude? Like, yeah, just blame it on God, blame it on God, blame it on God. God is the reason we live in dismay. Oh, blame it on God, blame it on God.
yeah, there's kind of a bit of desperation that starts to creep in on Once Upon the Cross. I mean, you have like Kill the Christian, and then I think on Trick or Betrayed, you have lines like rip up their Bible before it's too late. You can definitely start to.
I forgot about that.
Always comes through really clear. Like, well, that's got Jason.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit desperate. You start to feel like he's kind of turned his anti-Christianity into a bit of like an ideology almost, where it's just be, instead of being like an expression of like some kind of appreciation for the darkness in this world, it becomes some like a fucking doctrinaire thing that I don't know.
I
It's a
just
little
imagine him
bit
at home ripping
off-putting.
up a Bible. Like, sorry, Tyler, go on.
No, I mean that's
Oh,
pretty much all I had to say as far as on that particular subject is it's a little bit off-putting. I mean, musically that album is excellent. It's still an amazing listen. A little lesser than I would say Legion and perhaps even the self-titled, but you do start to hear some of that desperation creep in that I think would become even more stupid on following Deicide albums.
yeah, yeah. Once he starts, yeah, this definitely starts creeping in with Once Upon the Cross, and it only gets worse with subsequent albums. We can look at Serpents of the Light. There's the song "Blame It on God." Yeah, I already went over that. There's another one, Bible Basher. What's that from? Yeah, Incinerate Him. Yeah, he goes Bible Basher, Bible Basher, Bible Basher. Who is your God? Like, who is your daddy? Like, it's just wow. But yeah, we're getting into the bad side. So the Serpents of the Light came out in '97 after Once Upon a Cross, which came out in '95. So obviously, this is when death metal, as its original movement started waning. And I believe they're just stuck with a contract they had to fulfill. So they started releasing whatever, and Serpents of the Light. Everything starts to become really dumbed down and anthemic. Like Glenn Benton, he becomes like the force of Deicide at this point. It's just Glenn Benton barking at you, and the music's more like a backdrop to that. And the layers start to become really. I don't know if it's they didn't spend much time on it or what, but yeah, they're pretty lame. I mean, I'm not even a Christian or anything. I'm not saying it's like offensive towards me. It's just not well put together. And it's like bastards die, fucker Christ, will survive, kill yourself, die. Wow. And so bastard of Christ. Yeah, it keeps going on and on. But Serpents of the Light, I saw there were some like positive reviews of it back then, but it's definitely where the quality started declining. And with Incinerate Him, which came out in 2000, it was more like they were trying to become really popular. Everything was slowed down. The lyrics got even dumber and more. And like I can see like if they were trying to go for like the ICP crowd or Corn crowd or whatnot, because new metal was getting kind of big during that period, and if they dumbed down the music to such an extent, maybe they would pick up those fans. But yeah, really really lame lyrics. And like I said, it's the music is secondary to Glenn Benton's barking. And Torment in Hell, which came out in 2001, really really lame album. Probably the worst Deicide album by far. I remember when this came out, and It was a big letdown. Um, yeah, you have such stellar literature such as Christ Don't Care, Christ Don't Care. And yeah, it's a downward spiral from here. Scars of the Crucifix, I heard, was when Deicide started to have like the Hoffman brothers were more on board, or there was something like a dynamic with the band that made them congeal. But that's when you had the music video where Clint Bennett was kind of like a renegade, with the Hells Angels riding their motorcycles around and very simplistic chugging riffs, just playing the same chords. And then, yeah, you have the dumb lyrics still here. You have Mad at God, Mad at God. Um, Fuck Your God is also on the album. But you juxtapose this with David Vincent scribing lyrics, and it's night and day. This is more like angsty uh, 11-year-old writing this. Is like, oh, mom, you made me, put me in timeout, and I can't go play Nintendo. I'm mad at mom, mad at mom. But yeah, then after that, the Hoffman brothers, they exited. That's where all the drama and crap came out, and the whole death metal world was watching as Deicide was in shambles. But it's safe to say they're in shambles long before the Hoffmans left. Any thoughts on like Serpents of the Light and any of the other albums I mentioned?
So yeah,
Serpents of the Light's dull. Anyway, sorry, Shelly, go on.
I'm actually I'm gonna go out to bat for it because I don't mind it. So yeah, 1997. By this point, death metal really was in quite a sorry state. There were a handful of bands that were kind of bravely soldiering on and creating some pretty interesting stuff. Gorguts, Immolation, Incantation, to some extent Morbid Angel, although we can maybe debate that, although we have debated it before. Um, but yeah, Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. I don't think anyone would argue that that's not at least a pretty interesting album. But yeah, Scott Burns by this point as well. He tried to take steps to sort of leave metal, and do production in for other forms of music, like alternative metal and industrial and stuff. And for the most part, it didn't really come off for him. So by this point, he was, I think, training some sort of computing course, and he was like, only will I produce albums on request from bands. And Glenn Benton was one of these guys that was just specifically, I want Scott Burns on. So I think Serpents of the Light is, I can't remember if it's the last album. The last thing he ever produced was Suffocation's Despise the Sun. I can't remember if Serpents of the Light is the last full length that Scott Burns produced, but it's definitely one of. Um, and it really speaks to that time of kind of loneliness to some extent. Deicide weren't exactly the strongest unit, as you've kind of mentioned, Jason, both kind of as a band, but also as a musical entity. So they really weren't the right people to carry it forward into the late 90s.
But they,
And
they, they still had a following. They had a massive following. Like when I saw them play live, in the same venue, I saw Incantation. There was like 15 people there for Incantation, maybe a few hundred for Deicide.
yeah,
Around
but
the
I'm just
same time
speaking of
frame.
like carrying it on as a viable artistic project, I suppose. And Serpents of the Light isn't. It's. I think it's a passable album, but it's not like the savior of death metal at the time. Then it was probably at its lowest ebb by the late 90s. The reason I'm obviously the lyrics are stupid, and you do get the amplification of the stupid side of Deicide where they started becoming like an early meme or whatever. But I think some of the riffs are pretty solid. They take a much more uh, almost melodic approach. There's a bleed in of some European melodicism there, but the payoff is that it's much rhythmically more sort of direct, and yeah, the songs are much more straightforward. They are all focused around Benton getting out his dumb lyrics, but some of the riffs are pretty passable as far as I'm concerned. Some of them I even prefer to stuff on Once Upon the Cross. I think it is an album I'll throw on from time to time, but it does almost feel like a different band in a lot of ways. And yeah, the subsequent material, like yeah, the decline of death metal by the late 90s, early 2000s is kind of a well litigated topic by this point. And yeah, Deicide took the route that a lot of bands did in terms of like pandering to the angsty new metal crowd and trying to be like the more extreme version of what kids were getting into at that time, which would have been stuff like Slipknot and things like that, and just doing their version of being very, very angsty and groove based and catchy. And yeah, as you say, like retaining a following, but at what cost? And yeah, they sort of never really recovered. A lot of bands had that dark period where they released some very questionable material. A band like Massacre comes to mind, but they made a semi comeback to sort of legitimacy. But Deicide never really did. And I think to some extent it's because they never stopped making music. Like a lot of their peers took a long break and then came back,
Well,
reformed. Or
Incantation kind of had a similar trajectory.
they did, but they never fell off
Not they never
into
got as stupid as
embarrassing.
Deicide. Yeah.
Yeah. And a band like Immolation comes to mind, who managed to maintain a much longer streak of quality, but eventually kind of the metalcore via Behemoth influence really started to take hold by the late 2000s. Um, and they've never really recovered since either. But I'd say their decline is much more dignified than what Deicide did. But it kind of speaks to the fact that they are just very extreme characters. Like they're not thoughtful. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like Celtic Frost, where they did a Cold Lake, dusted themselves off, took a very long hiatus, and came back with Monotheist and later Triptychon as well. And I think everyone has kind of, respects Tom G. Warrior as a really interesting and profound and thoughtful artist. Whereas with Deicide, um, one Legion isn't enough to make up for the fact that I think they were always sort of this underneath, as it were.
Well, quick correction. Celtic Frost they did release Vanity Nemesis after Cold Lake, where it was kind
I'm
of like
aware
a
of that, but it wasn't enough to right the ship, as far as I'm
yeah. Then they
concerned.
took
It's not a bad album, but it's just
hiatus.
yeah. No, I know, but Vanity Nemesis is like a desperate attempt to right the ship, and it doesn't really work. It's
Something
kind of just
also is that Tom G. Warrior is obviously a very thoughtful individual. He's very nuanced, and you can tell that he gives a lot of his passion into his music, and it's very important to him. Whereas with Glenn Benton, he is like he flat out says, he's a carnival act.
yeah. That's what I
Where
was kind of driving at, with saying that he's much more aware of self-aware, I think, whereas yeah, Glenn Benton's just sort of ramming himself through life.
I'm kind of like I've exchanged words the past couple of years with Tom G. Warrior, just because he is so fucking accessible. I think it's just accessible to everyone, not just me personally. But I also think that that layer of engagement you have directly with Tom kind of makes you realize like he's just thoughtful in general. That's just who he is. Whereas Glenn Benton, he's not on any social media or anything like that. He just does interviews when he feels like it, and like you said, when he played London, or I think it was London or whatever festival you were at, Shelley,
I was in Czech Republic,
Czech Republic, for that festival there.
Brutal Assault.
Brutal Assault, that's what it's called. Where he didn't do any stage banter at all. He didn't. He just went there and played. He was just getting that paycheck. But that's you saw Deicide without the Hoffmans. At least I got to see the original lineup when I was a youngin. Uh, I have not seen them with Kevin Curry on, and they have a new guy in there from a band that my old bassist used to play in, and I forget the name of it, but Yeah,
Well, I
it's
would say
the
just on that, like, yeah, there is a sense in which he just wants the paycheck, and there wasn't really a show. But that's for a band like Deicide, that's almost exactly what I wanted. Is just really efficient. The music was on point. It was a really, really good set. They mostly stuck to the albums that I like. But other, I know other audience members do appreciate a bit of back and forth with the crowd, depending on the band, obviously. But and yeah, when it's a character like Glenn Benson, I was a bit surprised that he literally said three words, I think, to the audience. But I like that in a set sometimes. I just like wall to wall noise, but each to their own.
Yeah, he recruited a guy from the Absence, which is a metal archives that says melodic death metal. But when I first heard them years ago, I kind of lumped them together into like the deathcore crowd. Even though I wouldn't say it's like deathcore, but very similar in spirit. But Scars of the Crucifix, yeah, that's when Deicide pretty much broke up. Glenn Benton went and did that thing with Vital Remains, Dechristianize, and that album blew up. It got really popular in the metal underground. I remember when that happened, and Vital Remains got bumped up in general because they had such a successful album. And still to this day, they do tours without releasing much material. They're still hanging on, to the accomplishment they made with Glenn Benton. I think that album uh, obviously is very power metal influenced. And I think Glenn Benton saw the success from that, and that's the reason why he got Ralph Santola and Deicide, like the Stench of Redemption. This received a lot of favorable reviews. I remember when it first came out too. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. It did not sound anything like the Deicide I was used to. And I think this was the beginning of just like when they continued just to release albums, just to tour and generate income. Uh, because the heart of the music itself is not authentic death metal. I think it's more in league with power metal than traditional death metal. How about you guys? Do you guys also believe the Stitch of Redemption is more power metal than death metal?
It definitely has a lot more power metal in it. I think that has some partly to do with the addition of Ralph Santola, who has that much more, you know, kind of
Yeah,
power
he played
metal
with Ice
approach.
Earth. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly, to his guitar playing. So, he's got that much more like technical, like really arpeggiated style that's really popular in power metal. Um, and so I think that he had a lot to do with that kind of turn in Deicide sound, which, from what I understand, I think for the next few albums they kind of had that more melodic approach that was reminiscent of power metal.
yeah. When the Stench of Redemption came out, I remember Glenn Benton saying that the music is quote unquote Hoffman proof. Like the technical ability of Ralph Santola was so far beyond what the Hoffman brothers could technically do. And he was kind of parading that around, saying like, "No, it's yeah, we kicked out the guitarist, but we got better guitarists now, essentially." But it's a different expression altogether. It's not really deicide. It's more like a reimagining of deicide if it was power metal, and of course it's also partially death metal because the vocals and all that. But the songs are more straightforward. They're in distinct templates where you do have the verse chorus, in there, which was also on albums prior to this. The albums that weren't as good as the early stuff. Yeah, so essentially, Redemption came out. DSI got their second wind, and they released a number of albums since then too. And honestly, I might have listened to one or a song or two from each at some point in time, like "Till Death Do Us Part." I remember the album cover, but not any of the music. "To Hell with God." I don't think I listened to that. "In the Minds of Evil." Yeah, "Overtures of Blasphemy," and their latest one, "Banished by Sin." I know Ralph Santola was on three of their albums. Jack Owen left and he joined 6 Feet Under, because I know he's a 420 guy. And yeah, they got Kevin Kurian from Council of the Fallen, Order Ennead. Kevin, I saw a interview one time where Jack Owen was kind of making fun of Kevin that he not really good at writing songs, and so I'm unsure how involved Kevin is with writing the material, but yeah, none of the material has really stood out to me at all. It seems like they've kind of creeped into like a Cannibal Corpse syndrome where they just kind of have like a semblance of death metal, but in a rock format, where, or I guess it's more in line with like traditional heavy metal format where it's not far removed from rock, where it is very predictable, and the leads are specifically 2/3 into the songs and things of that nature, where very very predictable, just using a template, like Cannibal Corpse does. At least that's my opinion. I don't view that there's any like artistic expression in this type of music. If it's very much geared towards commercialization, I believe. This is the day job Deicide at this point in time, which could actually be said just like probably Serpents of the Light is when they crept in. But yeah, the Deicide became totally forgettable after Stench of Redemption. It's like, oh, look at this novelty, it's power metal and death metal. Then they just kept churning out that template a lot. So any thoughts on the NU new Deicide?
Well, before we do that, Tyler, do you have any thoughts on Serpents of the Light onwards? Because I have thoughts on Serpents of the Light that I've already expressed, but I'm not really familiar with anything after that.
I don't. That's going to be worth talking about. I guess the one thought that I have about everything from maybe not from Serpents of the Light. I can't quite remember exactly if this started happening on that album. Do you guys feel that talking about Glenn Benton's vocal performance that it kind of decayed over time? I've heard a lot of people say, and I somewhat agree with him, that his later albums' vocal performance that he kind of vomits or belches forth the lyrics with his later vocal sound, that like kind of deeper vocal sound that he developed, and a lot of people find it off-putting.
Well,
Well,
people's voices change when they get older, and I think he uses the same style of vocal delivery. It all comes from his diaphragm, but people naturally they age, and they change, especially the voice. And with old people, their ears get longer, their eyebrows get longer, nose hairs, yes, start the trimming that shit. So yeah, it's just people change, man. People change. Voices change.
well, I was gonna say,
What matters? What matters is keeping your big dick energy while you're going through those changes.
I was gonna say his vocals fell off a cliff after Legion, to be honest, because they're solid on Once Upon the Cross, but they're nothing impressive. Whereas on Legion, they're one of the most striking things about that album. But I don't want to keep talking about how when I saw him live, but it's relevant to this. I was dubious about his vocals because I know on the later albums he does, as you said, Tyler, kind of just bellow a bit more. But they were solid when I saw them. Admittedly, the two guitarists were doing backing vocals on the higher pitch bits, but he still has a great deal of talent as a vocalist. But I just yeah, I think maybe I don't know, phoning it in the studio or just going for a much more easy performance to mix into the generic metal that they're putting out.
Well, he also says that he doesn't listen to any death metal. That he wants to remain pure and not rip off any other band. Or that's so he says. I mean, it's just I don't think he's really devoted to death metal that much at this point in time. And, going back to 20 years ago, he was saying that he listens to the classics like rock music and all that. So the degree to which he's into death metal itself might be playing a role with his vocals. Might be playing a role with how the band is releasing music nowadays. It's more like an assembly line than true, genuine expression. I really, it's really interesting when you compare it, like the Celtic Frost comparisons. I think is apt. Like to take a hiatus if you don't have anything genuine to express, whereas Deicide just kept churning out albums for the paychecks. So yeah, I really don't have much to say about new Deicide other than it's very generic, template, Cannibal Corpse type of expression. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Deicide?
Not in particular. I think we've covered pretty much everything that is worth covering by Deicide. I know that probably the later Deicide was abbreviated, but I feel to our normal listeners, this is probably to be expected.
But yeah, Deicide is there's so much unremarkable material that they put out the past 20 years that yeah, it's kind of hard to. That'd be torture if we subjected ourselves to each release in full. So yeah, we're not paid journalists or anything. We do this in our spare time. So if we were getting paid to cover every Deicide album in this podcast, we might do that and might go into more details with some of the shitty albums. But yeah, this is just a hobby of ours. We have the big dick energy. We're just going to take it, as we want to. So yeah. Any closing comments in general?
Take that big dick as you want it. Um, no, other than I guess to just reiterate that Legion will always be one of the finest, most unique death metal albums ever made. The material that surrounds it is also worth a lot of time. But yeah, they're kind of remarkable in how bright they burned and how quickly they fell off. Like there are bands that I could compare it to in that regard, like I mentioned Dismember earlier, but I think even Dismember managed to keep up a base level of quality. Didn't quite sink as low as Deicide did, but they will always be a fascinating outcrop of death metal, not least just because Glenn Benson's such a weird guy. And I kind of, for all his flaws, I kind of just appreciate that he still is able to cause a bit of trouble, like comparing bands like Tumult to Weezer and striking up a debate about the fact that, as we mentioned, metal bands should sort of look the part and make an effort into kind of creating an experience and curating an experience around
So
music
David
itself.
Vincent would never say anything like that. That's a stark contrast between the two personalities. Where
No,
David
but he's
Vincent,
David Vincent isn't quite as abrasive as Benton, whereas Benson's not afraid to like poke the hornet's nest. Um, but yeah, that was my final thought.
well, good final thoughts, Shelley. But you tell her.
I mean, pretty much my final thoughts on Deicide is however much subpar material they've released, the material that they did release that was of quality was of such excellent quality that I don't think you can call yourself a fan of death metal and not be familiar with them. They not even just in their influence, but just in how much those albums still hold up today. It's difficult to find something that matches the ferocity of Legion and just the absolute landmark in what death metal is and the darkness of their early material, I think, is nearly unmatched. So, if you're someone listening to this who hasn't checked them out yet, I very much doubt that's the case, but you should definitely listen to them immediately. And for all the, as Jason puts it, small dick energy people listening to this who are going to comment and make some kind of hot take about how Deicide isn't good, I don't care. And yeah, that's about my thoughts on the band.
So Deicide is good. So I just have to express my big dick energy. Early Deicide is really good. However, Morbid Angel is better. Toodles.